This video is sponsored by Skillshare. As I've covered before, there is an undeniable racial disparity when it comes to American law enforcement and criminal justice. There are mountains of evidence that show that racial minorities, particularly Black, Latin, and Native Americans, are more likely to be stopped, searched, arrested, and assaulted than white people are. They are also more likely to be imprisoned and to receive harsher sentences than white people for the same crimes. And we can also learn from this data that this disparity can't be totally explained by things like poverty levels and crime rates. Because, those are the things that the naysayers like to bring up. If you'd like to take a look at some of this evidence, I've compiled a very long list of links which you can find in the description. Now, I'd be willing to bet that most Americans who aren't white have no trouble conceptualizing the idea that the police force might sometimes have racial biases, since non-white people generally deal with racist and racially insensitive people all the time. And there's no reason to think that police officers are somehow magically immune to this. But for some other people, this might not be as obvious, and anecdotes aren't always very convincing, which is why I personally try to look at things like studies and reports, which are usually a little more objective. Now, I could be wrong, but I think the majority of Americans these days are not overtly hateful to people of other races. Like, I live in Alabama and people ask me all the time, what's it like to be a Black man in Alabama? That must be rough. I feel like they assume that people wave nooses and yell the N-word at me when I'm walking down the street every day. But it's not quite like that. We've made some progress in this country. I think even if people personally harbor negative feelings toward a certain race, they still understand that it's socially unacceptable to share or exhibit those feelings in public. Now, in the era of Trump, we have definitely seen people be more brazen with their racism and xenophobia, but I still think those folks are definitely in the minority. I get the sense that most people feel like racism is just not a good look. I think most displays of racism these days comes in the form of ignorance or apathy or unconscious bias, which may sound tame, but when people with power have these biases, it can have a long-standing, widespread effect. If police officers, employers, lenders, judges, etc. have racial biases, their discriminatory actions can very quickly create a ripple effect that can exacerbate systemic problems. Because of this, many folks have proposed that people in positions of power, like employers or police officers, participate in special training to expose and hopefully get rid of some of those racial blind spots. In the years following the 2014 police killing of Michael Brown, most states mandated that police undergo some form of diversity or implicit bias training. But it's unclear whether this is having any practical effect. As far as I can tell, the rates of police harassment and brutality haven't changed all that much since then. But that wasn't that long ago, so new studies could come out at any time. According to the Washington Post, which has been tracking police killings in particular since 2015, the rates of those killings has not changed much either. So maybe there's another element to this story that we're missing. Hi, I'm T1J.
Follow me.
This video, like all my videos, would not be possible without my members and patrons, including homies like Taylor Hartman, A&K, Logger-Headed Doctor, and Hello Desdemona. If you'd like to support the channel, you can become a homie yourself by clicking the join button below the video or by checking out my page on Patreon. So I said earlier that I think outwardly racist people are in the minority, but that doesn't mean that they're evenly distributed across the population. Here's a hypothetical. What if I challenged you to go on YouTube and find a racist comment as fast as you can? A speed run of sorts. Tough challenge, I know. What would be your strategy? Would you pick a channel at random, or would you pick a specific type of channel to start with? Be honest. My point is that you're probably more likely to find racists in some places than you are in other places. And the question is, what if many of America's law enforcement agencies are some of those places? And if so, Why? I touched on this a little bit in a video I did about a year ago, but I wanted to explore it a little bit more. Now listen, there is absolutely no shortage of individual cases of police officers being shown to have ties to white supremacist organizations. I mean, I could keep going. There's so many. Like seriously, this could be the whole video. I find this pretty alarming personally, and maybe some of you do too. But one could still argue that those are individual cases. They don't prove that there's a larger trend on their own. Perhaps these are those bad apples I keep hearing about. By the way, y'all do know the full saying is bad apples spoil the whole bunch, right? Just saying. The United States intelligence community, including the FBI and the Department of Homeland Security, publishes reports every year detailing threats to the country, both domestic and international. And the threat of white supremacists, neo-Nazis, and other far-right ideologies has been a common trend in those reports for decades, to the extent that right-wing extremists are usually classified as the most dangerous domestic threat that this country faces. And our hyper-fixation on Muslim extremists since 9/11 has often been credited with helping these racist movements grow under the radar. But the activity within these groups has spiked since the rise and eventual presidency of Donald Trump. From the deadly rally in Charlottesville near the beginning of his presidency to the storming of the US Capitol that marked the end of it. Now, to be fair, right-wing extremists is a broad category that can include several different movements. But there are usually some general overlaps, like mistrust, if not outright disdain for the federal government, and straight white Christian identity politics. In a 2020 report, former Homeland Security Secretary Chad Wolf wrote that he was, quote, particularly concerned about white supremacist violent extremists who have been exceptionally lethal in their abhorrent targeted attacks in recent years. And Chad Wolf, if you didn't know, not really a great dude. He's one of the guys that orchestrated the separation of immigrant families during the Trump administration. And he was also the guy behind sending government forces to kidnap protesters in Portland last year. Even that dude says he's particularly worried about white supremacists. And he has good reason to be.
Certainly, as you say, it has been the biggest chunk of our racially motivated violent extremism cases, and itself the biggest chunk of our domestic terrorism caseload overall, and the most lethality over the last decade has been from these same extremists.
But it sounds like a digression, doesn't it? What does this have to do with racism within law enforcement? I briefly referenced this in my video from a year ago, but the FBI has been somewhat secretly investigating the infiltration of local and federal law enforcement by white supremacists for many years. They released a heavily redacted report in 2006, which acknowledges that white supremacist leaders and groups have historically shown an interest in infiltrating law enforcement communities. But also, in addition to its historical interest, white supremacist leadership has also engaged in recent rhetoric that encourages followers to infiltrate law enforcement communities. Most of the examples that they would give have been redacted, but it's clear that this has been a concern for a long time. This report also mentions something they call ghost skins, which is a term used for members of law enforcement who specifically attempt to blend in and hide their true motivation while acting as informants for white supremacist groups. So sometimes even those people I mentioned before who aren't overtly hateful can still be secretly dangerous. A more recently leaked FBI document states that investigations focused on white supremacist extremists often have identified links to law enforcement officers. So essentially, one of the strategies of far-right nationalist movements is to encourage its supporters to try and get jobs in law enforcement, which of course expands their power and influence in their local communities. Many of these jobs aren't that hard to get, and also they're naturally appealing to the types of people that support these movements. I mean, you get to carry guns around and tell people what to do. That's like half their whole thing. And it's probably not just a few bad apples that we can ignore. It's prevalent enough that the FBI has labeled it a concern. But don't get me wrong, the FBI itself isn't off the hook either. The organization is well known for its historical antagonism towards and surveillance and sabotage of civil rights activists, perhaps most famously with its COINTELPRO program under FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover. But this is a practice which apparently continues to this day. After the killing of Michael Brown, the FBI began to investigate an alleged new violent threat, which they designated Black Identity Extremists. And they used this as a justification for spying on and arresting Black activists, and in at least one case, arguably carrying out an entrapment on 2 young Black protesters. These investigations were considered by some legislators and civil rights leaders as irresponsible both sides mentality, or an attempt to deflect legitimate criticism of police brutality by inventing a non-existent threat. It's one thing to see exaggerated claims of activist violence from citizens or right-wing pundits, but it's especially concerning when it's coming from a major federal law enforcement agency. But even though the FBI has itself contributed to white supremacy throughout the years, it still considers these ideologies a major threat, which has infiltrated the police force and other law enforcement agencies. Unfortunately, the FBI has also largely chosen to remain stagnant on this issue, and the investigations they do undertake rarely lead to any charges or dismissals. The common response from law enforcement officials is that you can't punish someone for simply being a white supremacist. It's a First Amendment issue. But it seems a bit inconsistent to at once acknowledge that white supremacy is a growing violent threat to this country, while at the same time just shrugging your shoulders as you watch this movement invade our police departments. Funnily enough, the FBI is itself aware of this discrepancy and even addressed it in that 2006 report, saying, although the First Amendment's freedom of association provision protects an individual's right to join white supremacist groups for the purpose of lawful activity, the government can limit the employment opportunities of group members who hold sensitive public sector jobs, including jobs within law enforcement, when their memberships would interfere with their duties. And then again, it goes on to list some examples, which are of course fucking redacted. Another problem is that it's sometimes difficult to positively identify racists and white supremacists. Many police officers throughout the country openly identify with far-right groups like the Proud Boys, the Oath Keepers, or the 3%ers. And while all of these groups are brazen about their violent tendencies, none of them openly identify as a white supremacist movement. But anyone who does more than 12 seconds of research on any of these groups will find no small amount of unabashed racism coming from its members and supporters. But they do afford themselves deniability as well as legal protection. One officer in Portland was suspended without pay for erecting a Nazi shrine in a public park. But this punishment was later overturned as part of a settlement after that officer sued the city for slander after one of his superiors referred to him as a Nazi. I wonder what could have possessed them to call him that. But that's the type of thing that I mean. If you don't self-identify as a white supremacist, which most people don't, it's really hard to punish you for being one without violating First Amendment laws. Now, I can't pretend that I have all the answers to this problem, but some things seem pretty obvious, like coming to terms with the fact that anyone who is sympathetic to or directly involved with extremist or racist movements probably has no place in law enforcement. There needs to be a zero tolerance policy. Many police departments throughout the country could probably also benefit from more diversity, or at least ethnic makeups that more closely resemble the communities that they serve. And there also needs to be a safe way for officers to report their colleagues who are involved in hateful and violent behavior without fear of retaliation. At the end of the day, though, acknowledging that there's a problem in the first place is always the first step. And let's also be clear, as a person who respects data, I can't draw a straight line from the existence of white supremacists within law enforcement to the unequal treatment of racial minorities by law enforcement. Correlation does not automatically equal causation, but it has to be a part of the puzzle. And look, a growing culture of white supremacy and extremism in our law enforcement is just a bad thing, no matter which way you shake it. One thing does seem to be true though, this is a problem that has been insufficiently addressed both locally and federally. As I mentioned, racial disparity in policing hasn't changed that much over the past decade. And whether that is due to unconscious bias or explicit hate, or more likely, some combination of both, we need local, state, and federal agencies to make some serious changes if we're ever going to tackle this problem. That's just me though. What do you think? Big shout outs to the sponsor of this video, Skillshare. Skillshare is an online learning community for the creative and the curious, offering thousands of amazing classes on topics ranging from writing, illustration, music, and so much more. And Skillshare is focused on helping you learn no matter your schedule, so most classes are actually under 60 minutes in total. And they're all well produced and totally ad-free. And Skillshare is always launching new classes, so you can stay focused and follow wherever your creativity takes you. I think my favorite category on Skillshare is the creative writing category. And I've been looking into a class called Science Fiction and Fantasy, Creating Unique and Powerful Worlds by Lincoln Michelle. I think it's really gonna help me with my D&D campaigns. If you'd like to try out this class or any of Skillshare's thousands of amazing classes, the first 1,000 of my subscribers to click the link in the description will get a 1-month free trial of Skillshare. So go ahead and click that link below and start learning today. And remember, by supporting sponsors like Skillshare, you not only get access to a great service, but you also support me and help me take my content to the next level.